Good morning. Good morning. Good evening. Good afternoon. Wherever you are in the world, good whatever that is. It's Devin here for my odd little podcast here. And it is 9:23 a.m. I have a litany of liquids of varying temperatures surrounding me here. And it is stormy in Vancouver, which is refreshing, actually. A lot of times people comment how much they love the sun. They love the sunny days, and when it becomes miserable, they get depressed, and I tend to find myself going the opposite direction. I've tried 3 times to live in Los Angeles, and each of those times, when I finally left, tail between my legs, a lot of the reason was the weather. It's just always nice. But it's nice in a way that's creepy to me. The people who I know who have lived there their whole lives, and that's what they were raised with, love it. And I think a lot of that is just because that's what they were raised with. And myself, I was raised in Vancouver, and Vancouver is very dynamic in terms of weather. We'll go from 40 degree or, in and around 100 degree, whatever your preferred temperature descriptions are. And then it will go to snow in the winter sometimes. But we get 7 months typically of rain here. It's like the UK, I guess, to a certain degree. But we're in the forest as well, so it's just soggy and gray. And I was raised with it. And I find in absence of that type of weather, I don't tend to write a lot. There's been a couple of places that I've been that are inspiring weather-wise that aren't miserable like this. And I often think that I would really like Hawaii, obviously, or Maui, of course. I've never been, but it strikes me as being dynamic as well. But because of the way that I was raised, it's just, in absence of that sort of dynamicism that the weather here provides, I tend to just not be inspired to write at all. And LA, every time I went down there, it was just, I don't know, it was like the Truman Show. So, that being said, I feel like I'm waking up. So the words are coming slowly so far, but maybe in another 5 or 10 minutes I'll be up to speed. I got some tea. I'm all right. And how are you doing? If you were to ask yourself, how are you doing? What's the answer that springs to your mind? Well, if it's good, that's great. And if it's not, I hope it gets better. We're in week 9,434 of the great pandemic of 2020. I had an interesting week last week. There was a lot of things on a personal level that were happening, family and my living situation and all sorts of things. And I was put in a position to have to deal with that, as we have to from time to time. And it was a difficult period. And I remember thinking this last weekend that went by, I was like, wow, things just got really, really difficult. But then the next day, it's funny how it happens, how 3 o'clock in the morning, it seems like all these problems are are so insurmountable. And then the morning comes, and even if they're still there, there seems to be a different perspective on how to cope with them. And I think I mentioned on one of these last podcasts that I tend to find this period goes in 3-day cycles, where I'll have 3 days of sort of a dark mindset, where things are difficult and things are more challenging than they were. And then the pendulum sort of swings to the other side, and I find myself empowered to work through it. So the days for me tend to start around 7 a.m., I suppose. I've got a morning routine that I like to do, and then I start work in and around 9, take a break for lunch at about 1. Kids come home from school at maybe about 3:30, so I take a short break then. I try to get some exercise at 5, dinner, then I go back to work until about 11, and do it over again. I've got a nightly routine as well, but it's just that sort of sense of routine serves me well. It always has, to be honest. I like that kind of routine. Where was I? I don't know if it matters. I'm okay. It's miserable and I'm in my element. So I've been writing, but I'm conscious as well of how my writing has functioned during the pandemic. Much of my work during the day, when I say I go to work, a lot of it's logistical things. Like this week, I've got 4 to 5 hours of interviews a day. And then I'm getting all the tracks ready for the Halloween concert, and I've got ads to do for that. And I'm making stems for a bunch of these projects that I've been working on, that I've been handing off to a producer and working with. And just a lot of logistical things. Emails are always coming in and texts are always coming in this particular period as well, with everybody in the industry trying to find ways to pivot the work. There's a lot of opportunities, I guess you could say, but also distractions, because amidst those opportunities are a lot of stalled projects where people are trying to try something and then it falls through, or I find I'm being asked to confirm tours reasonably consistently, under the impression that they're going to fall through anyway. But it's good to have the legwork in play in the event that they don't. So there's a lot of that. But the writing has been interesting for me. I realize by writing in this frame of mind, where in any other circumstance was there not a pandemic and was there not all the anxiety that goes along with it, this would be an ideal situation for me. Just to be at home and to be in the studio and to write. But a lot of what happens during this period as well is that there's not a lot of real inspiration. I mean, there's inspiration that you can draw from, but a lot of it is things that I don't have a lot of desire to accentuate by writing about it. You know, it's like you can write a song about quarantine or pandemic or your fear or your anger or your anxiety. But I tend to find that by focusing on those things, it doesn't make them better, it just kind of strengthens them. So I tend to look for other things to write about at this period. And with the absence of experience, I tend to sort of write meandering sort of beige sounding material right now. There's a couple of things that have come up amidst maybe 25 or 30 songs that I've written that I think are really, there's some potential there. But it's a slow process. While I was going through the idea of doing these podcasts, and while I was sort of reflecting on the ones that have been done, I realized that the value of these for me allows me to sort of verbalize the past. And by doing so, it gives me a direct link and a tangible way to analyze what has happened, what life has presented thus far, the good things and the bad. And maybe ultimately doing these podcasts is simply a part of the process of the next record that I'm working on. Going through all the strapping stuff, we're now about to start what I guess we could call part 2 of the career. And that was with Ziltoid The Omniscient. So this album came out in 2007. And where do I even begin with this one? Well, let me think. At the end of the New Black, with the Hummer, DevLab, Syncestra, I had informed the guys in the band, in both bands, in DEVIN TOWNSEND band and Strapping Young Lad, that I needed to change on a professional level for the sake of the music, but on a personal level as well, because we were going to have kids, my wife and I. And I guess that was, in a lot of ways, maybe subliminally, part of the lyrics for Alien, with love and possessions, that song particularly. I never really wanted to have kids, and I think a lot of that had to do with a fear. I saw a great interview. I had mentioned this in an interview of my own the other day. I saw a great interview with Johnny Knoxville, of all people. And he said something that I thought was really fantastic. He was doing an interview, and someone asked him, "How do you deal with failure?" And his answer was, if you're doing something and there's no possibility of failure, I'm paraphrasing here, then you're not trying hard enough. It was almost like, to progress, you have to put yourself in a position where failure is a definite possibility. And I've known since the beginning that progressing as a person, as an artist, as an entity, is paramount to what it is that I've been trying to accomplish. And I guess having kids seemed like such a daunting thing, such a fear-laden task, that I just had dismissed it, thinking, well, that's something that I won't do. I can't do it. It won't happen. I hate the idea. And in fact, now that I have a teenager and all the things that have gone along with that, and those of you out there who are parents would know that it can be at least soul-shakingly frightening, the whole idea of being a parent. And I think a lot of the reason is, prior to having kids, my world had been so devoid of a reason for me not to focus on myself. All that music prior, Ocean Machine, Infinity, Terria, Physicist, Strapping, all that stuff. It was the me show starring me with special guests, me. And I felt like my themes, my objectives, my quote-unquote mission was so important. It was of such significance that it required all sorts of things, all sorts of hyperbolic statements and lyrics and all these things. And then when it had gone in the direction of strapping and I had perceived what I was doing as being so dark and so serious and so evil and all these things, we finally had kids. It just shifted. Everything just shifted. And it seemed, on some level, really childish, my obsession with myself. All the dramas with Infinity and all the drama with Alien and all the, I don't know what's going to happen and where am I in life, and is this piece of music, with a song like Truth, it's like this is the most important piece of music ever, and all these sorts of things. And all of a sudden, when the kid was born, I remember just feeling like, oh wow. I had a good friend who had told me, he said, well, when you have kids, it's going to be a choir of angels is going to sing and you're going to have an epiphany. And it's going to change your life. And that's what I was waiting for, actually. I was in the delivery room. It's almost like I had my whole routine set up. I had balloons and a catcher's mitt and whatever. It's like, okay, let's do this. And then when the kid was born, it was with such intense sort of, the gore and the blood and all these things. But it wasn't an epiphany in that sense. It wasn't this overwhelming, oh my God, this is the meaning of life. It was just, oh, that's how people are made. And this one has my eyes. And I don't understand how it happened. And so as opposed to going down this existential rabbit hole that I was prone to go down, what happened instead is I just kind of shifted and I was like, okay, well, what do I need to do? I don't understand this. I don't understand. It's beyond my capacity to understand this. You can say it's this miracle or it's magnificent, but that was kind of a given in a sense. It was just like, oh, it's nature. This is how humans are made. And the whole process of how reproduction works within the species and how we're biologically, emotionally, maybe in some sense spiritually, preordained to react to things in a certain way as a result of a biological imperative to propagate the species. But when that kind of just faded away, I was left with this awareness that, I don't really know how that works. During Alien, I was convinced it was, it's, the meaning of life. It's something to do with a universal theorem. It's a mathematical mosaic of infinite present in which all one needs to do is analyze and go into oneself and explore, psychonaut, that kind of vibe. And eventually you will be able to unravel the secrets of the universe. But then when the kids were born, I remember thinking, well, that's a little arrogant, isn't it? To think that you're capable of unraveling the infinite. And then I thought back to infinity, and I thought back to all these works that I had done that maybe unbeknownst to me at the time were rooted in this sense of, oh, I'm capable of figuring this out. I'm capable of unraveling this. I'm capable of quantifying infinity. And so my epiphany, if you want to look at it that way, with having kids was just a lot more like, oh, what do I have to lift? I don't know how this works at all. What do I do? Do you want me to boil some bottles? Do you want me to... And I think that sort of humility that came with that was, now that I look back 15 years later on Ziltoid, 14 years, whatever it is, math is not the strong suit, clearly. I realized that lesson was the next one in line. So at this point as well, we had finished the band, and it was, the breakup of the band was trying on all of us. And I was left after those experiences feeling shook, kind of to the core. And I thought, okay, well, I'm going to clear my life out here. I'm going to stop any extracurricular activities in terms of drinking or drugs or anything. And I'm going to cut all my hair off, and I'm going to cut my little stupid facial hair thing off, and I'm going to go get a job, and I'm going to do what I need to do in order to take care of the family. And there was a type of resignation to that was tinged with sadness to a certain extent, but it was also juxtaposed by all the interesting things that happen with having kids. Admittedly, in the first year, which is when Ziltoid was written, babies at that point are, somebody referred to them as need blobs. They're not really entities yet, in a sense. They just are screaming, shitting, puking, need blobs. There's no person that you can interact with yet. And so I was just running in circles trying to take care of that. And my wife had postpartum depression, undiagnosed, and there was some medical things that were going on with the kid that needed to be dealt with, and myself, and I ended up putting on, 50 pounds, I think. And it was a lot of work. And I had been smoking so much dope prior to this, and mushrooms and all this sort of thing. And so clearly I stopped all that. And I remember one day in particular, it had been maybe 6 months. Baby was 6 months old. And I thought, okay, well, everybody's in bed. My parents are gone. It's like, I'm going to go and I'm going to have a smoke. It's the first smoke that I've had in months. And I'd been hyper vigilant up to that point. The doctors had told us during the prenatal classes that sometimes infants just die, sudden infant death syndrome. And when I pushed them further, I was like, well, are there any precursors to that? Their reaction was just like, well, just sometimes that's what happens. And so I was sleeping poorly because I had not had that sort of responsibility before, and I had not had to sort of offshore all this attention I'd been paying to myself and my work to anything else. I'd been in a very insular position. So I wasn't sleeping. Anytime I heard a movement, I was like, oh, it's sudden infant death syndrome. That's what it is. So finally, 6 months later, I was like, I'm going to have a smoke, and that's it. Everybody was in bed. I had a smoke. And it just hit me like a ton of bricks. It wasn't like it was at one point where I would, get stoned and write and think goofy thoughts and whatever. It was just all of a sudden the reality of what was going on was right there. And I just was like, oh my God, now I'm getting paranoid and I'm walking in circles. And all of a sudden I hear screaming from upstairs, and they're like, there's something wrong with the baby. And I go up there, and baby was like not choking, and then they put the baby in my arms. They're like, you need to take care of this. And I just looked at it, and I was just ripped. And I was just thinking, I can't do this anymore. I need to be responsible for this. And all I'm doing now is thinking about, well, this is how human beings replicate, and this is your offspring, and all this sort of spacey stuff that up to this point had been fascinating to me. At this point, not only didn't serve any practical purpose, but made it very difficult for me just to function. So I thought, okay, well, this is also a good lesson. I remember when the baby was born as well, being at the hospital, and the night before he was born, when we were going into the hospital, I drank like a bottle and a half of red wine, and when we woke up to go to the hospital, stopped at a Starbucks, and I just went into the toilet and just barfed. And so when he was born, and I was in the hospital the next day, and he was up all night, and he's coughing, and then I was just watching him all night going, oh my God, he's coughing and he's turning red. And so I went running out to the nurses, and I was like, the baby is turning red. And they came back and they said, well, when the baby is born, they've spent all this time in utero, and there's the amniotic fluid that is in their lungs. And so in order to get that out, it's very common for them to turn red with the effort that is involved with coughing and expelling it. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. And then I woke up the next morning to get a coffee out in the nurses' lounge, and there was maybe 4 or 5 nurses standing around the water machine, and they're talking, whispering, and then they look over at me, and one goes, hey, how's your red baby? I'm like, I don't fucking know, come on. This is new for me. I was pretending I was a heavy metal guy for the past 10 years. This is real now. This is no longer some sort of abstract, existential, artistic metaphor. This is a tangible thing. So during that first year, where my job was boiling the bottles and changing diapers and trying to find ways to generate income after the bands had ended, and I had sort of ceased the activities that I had relied on up to that point to write. For Teria, for example, my process was I would wake up in the morning, I'd have 4 or 5 massive bong hits and just drink coffee on the stairs and just write spacey riffs, and that was great at the time. But now, even if I tried to have done that during that period, it would have been a terrible experience, because that time had ended, and this one had a whole new set of parameters in which that just didn't have a place. So I would try to write. I had gotten some new amplifiers and some new guitars and stuff as a result of doing the Ozfest. And I had set that up in my basement, and I had all this wonderful gear. Like, these are things that I'd always wanted. I had the right amplifiers and the right guitars and the right pickups and all this sort of thing. But no riffs and no inspiration for music. There was nothing. And anytime I went to write, and this has happened throughout my career, and I think if you're a musical creator, you'd relate to this too. Anytime I'm in this period of change and I pick up the guitar, my hands default to patterns and shapes that I had been doing for all the time prior, but it just seems tired and old and uninspired. And so I'd had all this gear, and I'd think, okay, well, I'm going to set up the rack like this, and I'm going to set up my amps like this, and I'm going to get this guitar like this, and I'm going to get the sound, and then I would spend all sorts of time learning about it. Now, this was new as well. I was learning about how to wire things up and how to modify guitars and how to do setups on guitars and figuring out what types of picks I actually liked and what types of tubes I actually liked. It became that. But at the time, I didn't realize that that was a skill set that would benefit me in the future, which it did. I just was convinced that I was doing it so that I could start to write. I thought, well, maybe all it will take for me to get to the point where I've got new riffs and new songs is to get this gear together. So I kept learning about it and changing it and learning about it and changing it. And at that point, I started creating relationships with gear companies. I was with ESP Guitars at the time and Mesa Boogie and I forget who else, Maxon and Line 6 and a bunch of companies. And what was interesting is, although the career had changed and although my bands were no longer active, my work that I'd done in the past had put me in a position where I had some degree of influence in terms of being on the internet and promoting gear and things like that. Yet every time I got a new piece of gear and set it up, or anytime I thought that all it would take for me to kickstart some creative energies would be a certain pickup or what have you, I'd get it and it would still be the same tired old riffs. I had worked out the main riff to hyperdrive and I kept playing that. And it seemed like even though it was really an interesting riff, lyrically it was more interesting to me because it seemed to be very much in line with, it's kind of this melancholy, you know, sail away, hey, I'm sorry, every day is a new day. I'm just trying to find a new way. All those sorts of things about hyperdrive. Yet when I tried to follow that inclination and say, okay, well, maybe there's a bunch more songs like that, that was the only one. So it was another stalemate. So life goes on. And it's kids and, wife and health and money and mortgages. And I remember actually right before I cut my hair off, I had to go try and get a loan so I could get some recording gear. I wanted to take time to just write for a while and see what came up. But I didn't have a studio. I didn't have any recording gear. I had all this guitar stuff, but I didn't have any recording gear. So I went to the bank to take out a loan for $50,000 to get recording gear. And that was the start of the studio. And a lot of the ways now, even though my studio setup is really professional, it's reasonably conservative. I don't have a massive amount of gear. I just have what I need. But it all started from this initial investment. And I remember going into the bank with all these, I had the skullet and I was 50 pounds overweight and I had a beige sweater on to try and have some degree of respectability to my look. And I remember looking in the mirror prior to getting into the bank and I was like, oh, you look like Krusty the Clown. The skullet at that point, which people, even to this day, are like, oh, you should do it again. I remember thinking at the time, this serves zero purpose to what my current reality is all about. Zero purpose. And that was underlined by looking at myself in the mirror prior to going to the bank and just being like, you look legitimately like a clown. And all these things that had been important to you before, like, hey, you suck, and fuck you, you fucking fuck, and all this antagonistic stuff was replaced by, I got to change the diapers, and I've got to get a loan, and I've got to try and figure out how to get the mortgage paid, and it was really, really a shift. And so I cut my hair, and I came back, and I kept trying to write. Nothing. During this time, I would go visit friends, and Beeve, my good buddy who ended up being in DTP with me years later, and he was in DTB, and we went to high school. I've talked about Beeve for years. I would go to his house when I was trying to change. I was trying to stop smoking. Kid had just been born. And I'd go to his house and we would just hang out. It was nice. Him and Scotty, his roommate, had a basement suite, and I would just go there during the day when wife and kid were asleep, and I'd go there and just play guitar and just try and figure out what was going on and sit on the couch and just chill out. Just a tiny apartment suite. And one day we were hanging out, and Beeve had bought this tiny little digital video camera. I think it cost him like $60 or something. He always had this, he would get a kick out of finding cheap, small, sort of digital things. Like he'd say, check this out, I found this tiny little recorder, or this tiny little guitar amp, or this tiny little video recorder. And it was just fun. He'd get them like maybe in from China or something. It was maybe a hobby of his, and he had gotten this video camera, and it was just terrible quality. And I said, well, we should make a little video where we each get a character. It was just fun. And he had a potato or something, and he had his stoner potato, I forget what it was, and Scotty had some character that he made up. And I took a sock, and there was a couple of Hershey's Kisses, those chocolates, right? And I put a piece of gaff tape on top of the sock and made those eyes. And then my little video, I was like, oh, I've got an alien. He's this intergalactic alien. And they were like, well, what's his name? And I was like, I don't know. What's his space name? Ziltoid. And so I did this little voice, and I was like, it was a little different then. I was like, I'm Ziltoid, and I'm an alien, and we did these things. And I remember he sent it to me, and I remember looking at it. And when I was a kid, I loved Jim Henson and the Dark Crystal, as I think I may have mentioned on one of these podcasts. I just loved it. I loved the idea that it was this elaborate world that he had created, and the amount of money that went into making the Dark Crystal was excessive, but he did it because it's what he wanted to do. He wanted to create a world. And so I'd always loved the idea of the Dark Crystal, even on Alien, the song Skeksis. Skeksis is one of the creatures from the Dark Crystal. And Skeksis, as a character in the Dark Crystal, was this sort of lizard, this sort of ostentatious lizard. And when I watched that little handycam video that Beeve sent me, I thought, man, I always wanted to make a Skeksis. I always wanted to make a Dark Crystal character. The making of the Dark Crystal was almost my favorite part of the whole movie experience. They had this 45-minute long behind-the-scenes thing where they had all the puppeteers and all the people with the silicone and the mechanisms, and they're making these creatures come to life, and then their personalities were defined by the puppeteer that was using them. And I hadn't thought of making music based on this at all. And I thought, well, you know what would be really cool is, because I'm in want of music at this point, because there's no songs coming out of me directly at this point, why don't I just try something different? Why don't I make a puppet? So I had a few people who I knew, Val and Marcus Rogers and a bunch of other people who I had worked with during the strapping days, that did special effects. They worked in the movie industry in Vancouver. And I called them up and I said, hey, I've always wanted to make a puppet. I've always wanted to make, a kind of monster puppet and make it look real and all of this. How do you do this? I've never done it. And they gave me some very rudimentary suggestions. They're like, well, you get the modeling clay and you mount it on something on a desk, and you start by modeling, and you get the eyes, and the eyes can be ping pong balls, and the clay version of it that you make, you then cast in silicone. So you have a reverse mold, and then you fill that with your latex, and then when you remove that, then you fill it with the foam that kind of keeps the solidity, and then you paint it and add the hair and the eyes and the mechanics. And they say it's a very involved and expensive process, but if you just wanted to make a puppet, we could help you make something rudimentary that might be fun. So I got a little stand and a bunch of modeling clay, and I just plopped it on the kitchen table, basically, because of the chaos of the kids and the parents over and the in-laws over and all these things going on, and the problems of, just postpartum and my changes in life. The kitchen table wasn't being used for anything. It was just kind of a dumping ground for everything. So I just set up this stand, plopped a big blob of modeling clay on it, and just started messing around. No objective, zero objective. And I was like, okay, well, it looks like he's very much along the line of the Dark Crystal Skeksis sort of character. And as I started to work on it, I would do a bit and leave it for a day. And then every time I walked by, I'd see it and I'd be like, well, maybe he needs some hair, maybe he needs googly eyes, maybe he needs a fang. And I would then call my friends in the industry, and they'd say, well, if you're going to do wrinkles on it, how they do that is you take a piece of saran wrap, like plastic cling film, and you wrap it around the clay, and then use a pencil, and you make the wrinkles on the saran wrap, on the cling film. And then when you take the cling film off, you'll have those wrinkles without having to dig into the clay. And it's a cool look. And I started doing that, and it really kind of fired me up, because I loved the idea of the Dark Crystal and that whole creating an alien world. And the more I did it, the more the ideas came together. I bought some bear's teeth from a taxidermy store, and had the ping pong eyes and put little veins on the eyes. And then I started thinking, as I walked by him more and more, I said, well, clearly he needs a theme song. Clearly Ziltoid needs a theme song. And I would continue going and hanging out with Beav and Scotty and what have you, and I would pick up Beav's guitar and say, hey, check it out. You remember that thing that we did in the basement? I'm working on this stupid puppet. It's funny. I'm really enjoying it because it's fun. There's no parameters for an alien puppet. It's creatively really wide open. What is he? What isn't he? It doesn't matter. As always, the subconscious has more of an intention than I perhaps gave it credit at that point, which I'll get into in a bit. But I would go over to Beav's house, pick up his guitar, and say, hey, check it out. I wrote this riff that's hilarious. If I have this alien, and he has a theme song. It would go like this: dun 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 dun, Ziltoid, dun 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 dun, the Omniscient, dun 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 dun. And I liked the idea that it was kind of this Saturday morning dime store cartoon thing. And there was zero intention of making a record. It was fun, and it was the first time that I had fun in a long time. I remember the baby even looking at this monster puppet that I was building, and his eyes are just, as babies' eyes tend to do, they're all crossed and they're looking at him. And I even got the impression that there was a 6-month-old kid looking at it like, dude, Dad, what the hell are you doing? And then I carried on with it, and I got this box of hair I had cut off after strapping. I had taken all the hair, and for whatever reason, perhaps the amount of time that I had spent growing these horrible poop sticks, dreadlocks, whatever you want to call them, I thought, well, I'm not going to throw them out. I'll just keep them in a box for posterity. How's that? What's that word? Posterity? That sounds like prostate. It's probably not that, but you know the one. And then I thought, well, what would happen if I put my hair on Ziltoid? And so I did. I knew that once it got cast in latex, I would have to do it for real. But I would put the hair on this clay model, and then this entity started kind of forming. I remember my mother coming by one day and looking at it and just being like, "What the hell are you doing? It's like you're making some weird little voodoo doll." And then it started snowballing, and I started thinking, wouldn't it be interesting if all those things that I've been afraid of thinking about, afraid of focusing on, afraid of just point blank, all that energy that during Alien, during City, during all these albums, I had written off as being an aberration or like a possession, that all that anger and all that hostility was separate from me, and that there's no way that I, as a, in my mind, gentle artistic entity, could possibly be responsible for that stuff. It clearly has to be an aberration. It clearly has to be coming from elsewhere. And then I started thinking more when I was looking at this puppet I was making, well, what happens if all of that, you're just afraid of yourself? What happens if that thing which you at one time had viewed as an alien is actually just repressed adolescence? And the idea of it being alien is more of an analogy for your inability to either understand it or face it. And that became really inspiring. I thought, in line with the analysis that has clearly been a part of this process, one thing that you've been afraid to analyze is that part of your creative identity. The darkness, the aggression, the anger, all these things that became strapping, all the same things within strapping that I became paranoid of because I didn't understand my motivations. So what I would often do is just consciously not think about it. Like, what is the easiest way for me to function with this? I would just automatically write with Alien or City or what have you, but then never think about it. There was no sense of accountability with it purposely because I was afraid of it. And then Ziltoid, all of a sudden I started thinking, well, if you can personify that, if you can objectify that part of your creative identity, that is, there's a certain amount of power there. There's a certain amount of petulance. There's a certain amount of aggression, but a lot of repressed adolescence. It's like your childhood stuff. Your inability, for example, to express yourself emotionally. Your inability to know how to articulate anger without fear of being reprimanded. Your connections to all sorts of things, sex, violence, all these things, that very obviously to me, there was a degree of repression, there was a degree of being stunted. And if I could put all of that into this character, and it was as soon as I put my hair on him, I thought, well, there'd be a way for me to explore that. I can't explore it without releasing it. For whatever reason, it almost requires me releasing it to be able to have the attention to detail that is required. Maybe that at that point had something to do with, and maybe still does, the need for validity from other people's reactions to it. I know that it works because other people feel similarly about it, or whatever it is. But I didn't want to explore that stuff anymore. I didn't want to explore the strapping stuff anymore. And even though there's a lot of things hidden in there that still very much needed exploration, I was afraid to. But with Ziltoid, I could frame it in this dumb comic book style story. So all the things that Ziltoid as an album were about was an extension of Alien, was an extension of strapping. Except now I put a face to the creative mechanism. So now, as opposed to me thinking of this thing within me that was creating this energy as being this malevolent, demonic thing, I was now like, oh, it's this dorky alien. And not only was it something I could look at, I could say, oh, it's me. So for the first time, I was able to see all these things that had been confusing to me as being very clearly just a manifestation of all the baggage over the years. So next came the sort of conundrum. I had written a theme song. I had a character. I was aware that the character had begun to appear maybe as a way psychologically for me to put a face to the past. But then what is the album about? How can I discuss all this? How can I get it out of my system? How can I purge this without being so direct about it that it sounds as pretentious as maybe this podcast about it does? And it became clear that, well, sky's the limit. You could just make a concept, and the concept, the more absurd it is, the better. Because within that absurdity, you can explore sonically and thematically all these things that you're afraid of. And it actually doesn't matter what the story is. The more out there, the better. It could have characters, it could have a protagonist and an antagonist, and it can have this, that, and the other thing. And I remember a friend of mine spurred the idea on about coffee when I was sort of riffing with him. I'm like, well, what is Ziltoid's motivation? And he's like, well, maybe it's something silly. Maybe he's got all sorts of power. He's got all sorts of influence that he's young and immature and doesn't know how to wield necessarily. And he's got a bad temper, and maybe all he wants is just a cup of coffee. Maybe that's it. And then I started thinking about that, and I was like, well, maybe we could take the idea of he ends up destroying worlds and raising planets and wielding unbelievable power based on the fact that he's just petulant. He's just a kid. And, all he wants is just, something benign. So then I took the idea of the coffee, and maybe that could be, not only does he want a cup of coffee, but maybe coffee plays some role on his planet where here it's a stimulant, but there it's like the ultimate source of fuel. Like it whatever, you can bend space and time with coffee, like the spice from Dune. And then further from that, maybe Ziltoid as a character in the eyes of humans is this omnidimensional, hyper-powerful alien overlord, but back home, he's just this kind of awkward nerd. And so maybe his quest to find this fuel is ultimately he's just trying to fit in back home. And if he can bring back all this fuel, he'll be accepted. He won't be an outcast. And maybe amidst that, when he presents himself to humanity, and humanity, who is only on a certain dimensional awareness, sees this awkward, nerdy character that's a dimension above, then they will revere him as like a god. And because he's as insecure as he is, that becomes his motivation. And throughout that, I started thinking, okay, well, then he meets, maybe there's a sentient nebula, maybe the omnidimensional creator, maybe he's able to present all he has found to this interpretation of the infinite, or God, or whatever you want to call it. And maybe there's this other character, maybe his sidekick. I started thinking about all these old comics and all these things about, well, what typically happens? Joseph Campbell and Hero's Journey and Captain Spectacular being maybe the other side of me. Maybe Captain Spectacular can be the rational, sort of puffed up right brain father or what have you, and they're actually two sides of the same coin, and his sidekick could be this tiny little furry cute thing that has a voice that destroys planets. And it really didn't matter. I just started riffing, basically. And then as the story went, it became clear that the trajectory of the story was, just nonsense, really. And I had Beav and Dave come down and do voices for it, and Beav did the narration. That whole Ziltoid, that's Beav. He was there when I was writing, and he was there when I came up with the character. You know what I mean? It's having him involved was great. It was another way for us to hang out. And Dave Young came by and did the voice of the omnidimensional creator, and it just started to evolve. And I started writing. And the difference with this album and all the other ones was I did this one on basically the least amount of gear that I could technically do at that point. I had done the last strapping record, The New Black, with Mike Fraser at the Warehouse Studios, and the full band and drum techs and guitar techs and Armory for drum tracking. And that album ended up costing, between the album and Ozfest, maybe $200,000 or $300,000 just to do that album. And I remember thinking, even at the time, that's absurd. That's an absurd amount of money. And if I'm going to make a record and support the family I want to see if I can do this for less. And another part and another motivator for me was the sense from certain engineers or producers that I had worked with that you can't make a record for under a certain amount of money. You know, kind of scoffingly, like a professional record can't be made for less than $200,000. And I remember thinking, I don't know if you're right about that. So the $50,000 loan I took out from the bank, I bought an iMac, I bought a Line 6 XT Live, I bought a Shure SM7 microphone, I bought a Universal Audio 6176 preamp, I bought a weighted keyboard, I got a bunch of software, I got Pro Tools, I had been working with TuneTrack through my involvement with Frederick, and they had just released Drum Kit from Hell. And between the Line 6 Pod, XT Live, TuneTrack, and this little rig, that was it. I said, you know what, I'm going to record the entire record like this on my own, with a drum machine, with a Line 6 Pod, with one microphone, my one main guitar and a bass, but I'll do all the keyboards myself. I'll do it all myself. Have my buddies come by and maybe add some voices or what have you, but that's it. And as always, I started the artwork at the same time, and I contacted Travis Smith, who's always kind of been there for me and always has been a fantastic cohort in terms of being willing to go down these creative avenues that sometimes work and sometimes don't. I said, hey man, I'm trying to put together what would be kind of like a comic book character. And he's like, well, we could have maybe like 10 cents in the corner and have him on the cover. And so he started working on this at the same time that I started putting together these digital songs. And in hindsight, the first version of the TuneTrack Easy Drummer software, Drum Kit from Hell, doesn't hold up as well as their software now. I mean, the software that I use from Easy Drummer and TuneTrack now is, you know, it's incredible. And even at the time, it was an epiphany for me because it sounded like drums. They have this technology called round robin where they'll have 7 different dynamic layers, and within each one of those layers is a rotating cast, I guess you could say, of samples. So if you've got a snare roll, and this was kind of new at the time, if you got a snare roll that's going ta 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 ta, each one of those within the dynamic range will be a different sample. So it sounds much more like a real drummer, and that would be the case with the cymbals and the rooms and all this. As opposed to a traditional drum machine where it's the same sound each time, so it's like ding, 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 ding. This would be more like it's hard to explain, but. And I would go for a drive as I was writing these songs, and I'd listen to it, and I'd be shocked at how cool it sounded. And that started sending me down these avenues with certain arpeggios and certain themes and all sorts of things that I could do entirely on my own in the basement after my fatherly duties were done for the day or what have you. And this record started to appear, and I could do it without a band, and I could do it without other musicians. And it could be thematically a way for me to contend with some of the baggage that had started to accumulate after Alien in a reasonably safe fashion. During this time, I started producing bands too. I thought, okay, well, I need to make a living. I'm not touring. I'm not putting out records. I had no intention really of putting Ziltoid out. I just was doing it. So I started producing. I did a couple of records for Darkest Hour and Misery Signals, and who else did we do at that time? Did a bunch of bands. And so I would do these bands and learn more how to produce, learn more how to engineer, and then come home and just keep sort of applying those things to the Ziltoid record. And then one day I scheduled a meeting with Thomas from Inside Out, who had been there since Physicist, who I've mentioned before. I said, listen, man, I've got this bizarre idea that I've been working on without any intention of it becoming a record because, it's drum machine, it's super low buck, super budget sort of thing. But it's turning into something that I actually think is the next record. And he said, well, what's the concept? And I'm like, well, it's this omnidimensional alien that is in search for the universe's ultimate cup of coffee because it is fuel for his home planet, and he's a nerd back there, and he's got this planet smasher, and then he meets God, and there's a sentient universe and nebula, and he's like, hold on, what? I said, well, ultimately it acts as a metaphor for all that I'm trying to process from the first part of the career, from all of what had happened since we've known each other, strapping, infinity, drugs, all that. It's a way for me to analyze it, put a face to it, and work through it. So when I go to what happens next, this will act as a bridge between then and what ultimately ended up becoming Devin Townsend Project. And after we talked a little bit more, Thomas I heard him sort of go, okay, let's try it. Let's see. And so I went about making, and I wanted to mix it too on my iMac, on my little Macintosh computer, Apple computer. I wanted to do it with what I had. I didn't want to go into the studio to mix it. I didn't want any additional gear. I wanted, almost as an example, I wanted this record to be done with the least amount of gear possible, without any additional input, without anybody playing on it. I wanted it to be this insular little project that ultimately benefited from all the humility that came from having kids and the chaos that came psychologically from that transition, and the awareness that a lot of what I had deemed as being so important to me creatively in the past had a certain amount at least to do with the fact that I didn't have to deal with any real life. I didn't have to have somebody else in my life to care for. I didn't have to put myself aside for the sake of an entity or a child that is helpless, or your parents or your wife or none of that had been. I'd almost been in this state of suspended reality since the Steve Vai project that at no time forced me out of that. And so I could swirl in it and get obsessed with it and all these things. And so Ziltoid as a character and as an album served much more as an overarching summary of what had happened up to that point than what the story would imply. On the surface, it's this dumb little drum machine album, about an alien looking for coffee. It's ridiculous. But that served as a platform for me to have a reasonably safe space to explore things that I was uncomfortable talking about in my work. But if I didn't talk about it, it would not allow me to progress. So Thomas said, yes, we'll put it out. And the only investment that I did with this record, other than having Travis involved on the art, was mastering. So I hired Yui Nastasi, who was the guy who had mastered The New Black. because I figured that although I'm going to mix it myself and it's, I'm still learning how to mix, and Kestra was the first one. This was technically the second record I had ever really mixed. I said, if we can have somebody at least master it so the frequency range is a little more appropriate and the volumes are right, then that's a way to kind of do it. So that was an investment as well. And then when it was finished, I remember listening to it and thinking, well, it is what it is. It's like a glorified demo in a sense. But it had some really, really emotional moments. And it had some really, really vibey moments too. And the summary at the end of Ziltoid, which at the time when it came out, the reviews for it were mixed. People are saying, this go from strapping to this drum machine alien thing, it's just stupid, basically. But I wasn't comfortable in making the explanation of this record what I'm comfortable in doing now. It just seemed it was too soon. And frankly, I probably didn't even know to the same extent that I do now. But one thing that was very conscious was the song Color Your World. So at the end of it, in the end, it's beautiful. That whole idea of we went through it and now it's over. And how do you feel now that it's over? And now that, it's time to cut your hair, it's time to change, it's time to move forward. How do you feel about this fear and this? And that was the moment that I felt was where an epiphany came. I was like, oh, it's beautiful. All of it. The pain, the beauty, the kids, the birth, the death, the music, the anger, it's beautiful. And so the rhythm at the end after that, it goes, we are all puppets. And that rhythm, dun, 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 is the same rhythm from Infodump, from Alien, which is Morse code for Om, the overarching vibration of the universe, they say in some of these, spiritual fronts. Om, A-U-M, Om, O-M. So that rhythm there, we are all puppets, and the idea that Ziltoid was a puppet became this kind of meta thing where the whole act of being a human, it's like we play out these roles. It's like the universe is entirely light, and our role in it is a projection of that light on this moment. And so all that we play, whether or not in this life we play musician or mother or servant or whatever our trip is, we're a part of something. And the idea of our avatar, our entities that we play, being like a puppet, in a sense, that we control from a place of higher consciousness, I guess, became really the point of that record. And then at the end, the last song, Tall Latte, after this big, massive, dramatic, absurd arc about this alien and his huge amounts of power and the light and the universe and Om and all these things. The last song is almost the most important part of it, because the guy who was... So basically the last song, Latte, Tall Latte, it ends up that this entire story was a daydream in the mind of somebody who's working at a coffee shop. And he ends up just waking up to realizing that there's a customer that's cussing him out basically for not paying attention, or his manager's cussing him out for not paying attention. And it's that guy in the coffee shop was supposed to be a metaphor for, I guess, where I found myself. That through all of this, the reality of my life was much different than this drama that I had played out over the past however many years. And it was almost like your inability to understand yourself, or the lack of real power that one has in day-to-day life. It's easy to project that and create this thing that, no, it's actually not that I'm a father with a child. It's not that I'm a worker at a coffee shop, whatever the analogy is. I need to believe it's more. I need to believe I am this massive, powerful, domineering, malicious alien. And then by getting to the end and recognizing that it's a role and it's a story, the reality of that is, it's almost like waking up from a decade-long dream. And almost immediately, I started writing Key. So yeah, Ziltoid. I always liked the idea as well that I didn't know when I was writing the record that it's pronounced omniscient. I think it's pronounced that. Omniscient. Omniscient? I didn't know that. I thought it was omniscient. So I had done all these promos for it with my puppet. And I said, I'm Ziltoid the Omniscient. Yes. And then, as the internet tends to do, someone's like, it's actually pronounced omniscient. And I was like, not on his planet it isn't. Fuck off. And before I go here today, what really changed things was Tuska Festival in Finland. Joni, who's the promoter of that, he contacted the management I had at the time. He says, we want to do Ziltoid in its entirety in Finland. And I was like, there's no way. People would have to learn it. I haven't played live. I can't do this. But it also seemed like, wow, if I did do it, it would allow me to have an objective so I could kind of start playing again and work through all this past. And that ultimately became the DTP. And that became another decade of, I guess, retroactively trying to figure out what had happened through Key Addicted Deconstruction Ghost. So Ziltoid, as silly, as low budget, as demo-ish as it sounds, was almost the pivot point for this entire story. And there was before it and there was after it. And they're two entirely different versions of who I am. Next record I'm going to talk about will be Key. And we're working towards it. And like I said in the beginning of this, the whole objective of this podcast, as much as I like to think that maybe there's some benefit for people, and as much as it maybe allows me to keep in contact with people, verbally here at least, I'm writing a new record. And Empath was the culmination of all of this. So strapping, DTP, all the Infinity, Ziltoid, all of that, it all came together for Empath. And now I'm in a position very similar to where I was whilst writing Ziltoid, where every time I pick up a guitar, there's nothing there. And it's not that there's nothing there, it's just the changes that have occurred have been artistically quite monumental for me recently. And I'm waiting for all the pieces to coagulate into an identity. So I'm very interested in what is coming out next in my creative identity, in my mind. And the best way for me to be able to start putting together the pieces of this new puzzle is to have some degree of analysis over how I got to where I am. And I'm in a completely new place right now. And it's a place that I really, really appreciate. It's much different than Ziltoid, much different than where I was with any of this stuff. But I'm working towards talking about empath. Key is next. I hope you guys are doing okay. And I sincerely wish you and your family and your mental health nothing but peace. And I hope throughout the chaos of this period, you're able to find moments that will allow you to reflect to a certain degree on your pasts as well. Maybe it won't work for you, but for me, I do find that if I can identify where the mechanisms are in my current life that are causing me problems and trace it back to where the genesis of that problem was, then I do find peace. So until next time, take good care of yourself. Dev out.